G'day guys, on today's video we're going to show you how to change the rear wheel bearings and axle oil seals on this 80 series Landcruiser. The video is going to apply to all 80s with disc brakes in the rear and all 105 series cruisers as well. We're going to be installing the WBK3 kit from Tamer, which comes with your inner and outer wheel bearings, your grease seal and your flange gasket, and you're going to need one of those per side of the vehicle. While you're doing the wheel bearings, it absolutely makes sense to change your axle oil seal as well, so we've chosen to purchase two of those separately through Toyota. So let's jump right in. So we'll just quickly run through all the tools and parts we're going to need to do the job today. And as you can see, there are quite a few, but fortunately you'll have a lot of this at home already. We've got some safety glasses and some nitrile gloves for protection. And then we've got some paper towel, an old toothbrush, a razor blade, and some brake and parts cleaner for cleaning everything up. Then we've got some newspaper and some blocks of wood that's going to help us doing our wheel bearings. We've got a brass or copper hammer and a regular steel hammer, and then a set of vice grips or similar. Next, we've got a bearing and seal driver kit, which is super handy for installing our new wheel bearing races. And then we've got a drift, in this case a 6mm or 1/4 inch round steel bar, or you can also use a brass drift as well. Then a seal puller tool, or if you don't have one of those you can use a crowbar as well. Then we've got a couple of 300mm cable ties, two M8 standard coarse thread bolts, and a Phillips head screwdriver. A metric socket set which comes with the socket wrench, a breaker bar, and various sockets ranging from 12 up to 24mm, and then a torque wrench as well. We've got a special service tool from Toyota which is used to do up your wheel bearings to the appropriate setting. If you don't have that, you can use a couple of flathead screwdrivers as well. For the parts that we're going to be installing, we've got two new crush gaskets for the differential. You'll need a 1 pound or 450 gram tub of multi-purpose wheel bearing grease, and one tub is enough to do both sides. And then we've got 4 litres of an SAE90 differential oil, in this case with an LSD additive in it, and then a hand pump to assist us in getting that oil up into the diff. Lastly, you'll need a drain pan with a minimum capacity of 4 litres, as well as a jack and jack stand. Before you get underneath the car, it's a good idea to take it for a quick 10 or 15 minute drive just to get the oil up to operating temperature. We've chocked both of the front wheels and we've put the car in park or in gear with the handbrake off, because we're going to need to be able to rotate those discs later on. Firstly, we need to remove the filler plug from the rear diff, because that's going to allow the oil to drain out more smoothly. For that, you're going to need a 24mm socket on a breaker bar with an extension. Grab your drain pan, which will need to be a minimum capacity of about 4 litres, and we're going to crack that filler plug. Once it's loose, you can remove it by hand. With that same 24mm socket, we'll crack the drain plug. And then we're going to remove it by hand, and just try and get your hand out of the way as quickly as possible, and we'll drain that oil into the pan. We're going to put those two plugs off to the side and clean them up, because we're going to reinstate those later on. With the wheels still on the ground, we're going to take a 21mm socket and crack each of the 6 wheel nuts. And then we're going to jump underneath the car and lift it and put on a jack stand. Place your jack underneath the axle housing. We're going to jack up the car on one side and then put our jack stand underneath. And then slowly lower the car onto the jack stand. Now grab your 21mm socket again, and we'll just remove those 6 lug nuts and take the wheel off. We're going to start by laying some newspaper out on the floor underneath the disc, just to protect it from any greases or oil dropping down. The first step in disassembling the disc and hub assembly is going to be to remove the brake caliper, which is held on by 2 17mm bolts from the back side. The 2 bolts that we need to loosen are this one here and this one down the bottom here. So take your 17mm socket on your breaker bar, and we're just going to crack each of those bolts. Because of the location of the shock absorber, you'll find you need a fairly short socket to get onto the bottom bolt. Once they're loose, you can remove them the rest of the way by hand. So you can put those 2 bolts off to the side, because we're going to clean them up and put them back in later. So at this point the caliper should be loose, so we're just going to pull it up off of the brake disc. Now you will find that this brake hose here will get quite tight, so just be careful you don't stretch that by too much. But you should be able to gently just massage the caliper up over the edge of the disc. Then we're going to pop that off to the side. We're going to grab one of the cable ties and we're going to cable tie through the bolt hole that had the 17mm bolt and pop it up onto the suspension behind. And then it's nice and secure out of the way while we do the rest of the job. Now we're going to start on disassembling the hub. So first up, we're going to take our 12mm socket on the socket wrench and remove each of these nuts. Once they're all finger tight, you want to remove the 6 nuts and the flat washers behind them. You'll usually find that the cone washers stay stuck inside the hub, so in order to loosen those, we're going to take a brass or copper hammer and place that on the end of the stud, and we're going to hit that with a regular steel hammer. It's important to use brass or copper because that won't damage the threads. So you can just see one started to jump out there. And another. Sometimes they won't jump out all the way by themselves, so you can take a pair of vice grips or similar just to pull it out the rest of the way. Take your 6 nuts, washers and cone washers and we're going to put them in the pile to be cleaned. In order to separate the flange here, we're going to take 2 standard M8 bolts, so that's an M8 by 1.25mm coarse thread, and we're just going to thread these into each of the holes here. And then we're going to alternate doing these up one at a time with a 13mm socket, and that's going to separate the flange. So you can see there that as I do up those bolts, it's starting to push the flange apart. Once it's nice and loose, you can back those bolts off and remove them. At this point we're ready to remove our axle, so we've just laid out some fresh newspaper on the ground, and as you pull this out you may get a little bit of diff oil draining down, so that's why we've got the newspaper on the floor immediately underneath. So you just want to pull straight out and support that axle while you pull it out. Then we can remove the brake disc, and it should just pull straight forward and off. And again we're going to place that in the pile to be cleaned. Looking from the back side again now, we're going to remove the ABS speed sensor, which is this one here, which is held on by a bracket with a 12mm bolt down here. In this case, on one side of the vehicle, it's pretty difficult to get to this with a 12mm socket, so we're going to be using a 12mm ring spanner. So once you've got that all the way loose, pull the bolt out, and again we're going to put that in the pile to be cleaned, and you should be able to just pull your ABS speed sensor out. And we're going to make sure we give that a good wipe off and clean before we put it back in later. In order to remove the lock nut that holds the wheel bearings in, we first need to remove these 2 Phillips head screws. Now we can remove that lock nut, and you'll see there are 3 big holes around the edge, and that's where your SST 3 prongs will poke into. If you don't have this though, you can put screwdrivers in each of those and use that to turn it. So we're going to loosen that off and remove the lock nut all the way. And you want to take that lock nut as well as those 2 Phillips head screws and put them in the pile of parts to be cleaned. Alright, so at this point we're going to be able to pull the hub off of the spindle. So you want to place a thumb on each side and pull directly out towards you. And that should pull away like that. And you'll notice that the outer wheel bearing and the thrust washer will come away inside, so you can pull those 2 out. We're going to throw away that bearing, but we are going to clean up and keep that thrust washer. The last thing to remove from the car is the axle oil seal. So we're going to take the seal puller tool and we're just going to gently pop that in the corner and just pop that seal out. And again, we're going to be installing a new one of those today. Now's the fun part where we get to clean everything up, and we're going to start with the spindle. It's a good idea just to start with some rags or paper towel first. If you put the brake and parts cleaner on straight away, you can sometimes get a bit of a soupy mess. Make sure you clean inside the end of the spindle as well, because we're going to put our new seal in there. It's a good opportunity while you're here just to give your handbrake pads a quick wipe as well with some brake and parts cleaner. And then we can move on to cleaning everything that we removed from the car. For the axle shaft, we're just going to start by wiping all of the excess diff oil off there. As you can see, in our case, the flange gasket has stayed stuck onto the axle side. So what we're going to do is take a razor blade, in this case it's a replacement blade for a Stanley knife, and we're just going to run that along the flange just to pick up any of that spare gasket material. When you do this, you want to hold the blade at quite a shallow angle just to make sure that you don't damage the flange. And at this point you can lay out some fresh newspaper for your clean pile. Looking at the hub now, the outer wheel bearing and thrust washer came out when we removed it from the car, but the inner wheel bearing is still held in by the oil seal here. So we're going to place this down on some wood blocks just to protect those studs. Then you want to take a seal puller or a crowbar, and we're going to pop that underneath the seal and use that just to pry the seal out from the hub. You can throw that old seal away because we're going to be installing a new one, and same for that inner wheel bearing. Next, we just want to wipe out as much of that old grease as we can. Once you've got most of the grease out with the paper towels, you can start to hit it with some brake and parts cleaner. Once you've got that reasonably clean, we're going to get started on removing the old wheel bearing races. And the way that you do that is you take your drift and a hammer, and we're going to place the drift alternating between this ledge down here and this ledge here, just to knock that race out. And then we're going to do the same thing on the other side. Just make sure when you do this that you keep the drift nice and vertical so that you don't score the sides of the hub. And you want to alternate between the ledges to make sure you knock the race out evenly. And there we go, that first one's fallen through. So flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. Once the old races are out, you can give it a final wipe out with some brake and parts cleaner to prepare the surfaces for the new races. I'm going to start with the outer wheel bearing race, which is the smaller one. You want to place it with the wider side facing down. And we're going to use the bearing and seal driver, in this case it's the 72mm attachment, to press that down into the hub. You want to start off slowly, and once you're happy that it's going in evenly, you can start to hit it a bit harder. And there you go, once it's all the way home, you'll start to hear the sound will change to a high-pitched clanging noise. Then we can flip that over. We're going to do the same thing for the inner wheel bearing. In this case, you want to be using an 81mm driver for the inner race. Same thing with this one, in that the wider side goes in first. For this one, because it sits outside of the hub, you can use a block of wood just to get it started until it's down and flush with that edge. Now that it's started, we're going to hit it the rest of the way with the seal driver. And there we go, that's all the way home. We're going to start with installing our new wheel bearings now. We're going to be using this multi-purpose wheel bearing grease, and we're going to start by packing that into the hub. So you want to take a couple of handfuls and just put it inside in the area between the two wheel bearing races. It's just a bit easier to do this part first while there's no wheel bearings in there. And you're just packing it to be level with the inside of the hub. We're going to start with our inner wheel bearing, which is the larger of the two. You want to take a healthy handful of the grease. What we're going to do is, using the larger side of the bearing, we're going to push down and basically push that grease up through the rollers until you start to see it coming up through the top. So you can see there that that grease is just starting to come up between the rollers there. And you want to just slowly rotate the bearing, getting all of the rollers in that same fashion. Once you're happy that you've got grease coming up through the rollers all the way around, so they're thoroughly packed with grease, you can just wipe some around the edge. And then you want to drop that down into the race with the smaller side facing down. The reason we do the inner wheel bearing first is because it's going to be held in place by this seal. Now you want to place the seal with the gold side facing up. Unfortunately, we can't use a bearing and seal driver tool for this one because of this lip here. So what we're going to do is just try to get it started with some gentle tapping with the hammer around the outside on that metal surface. Once you've got it started, you can take a block of wood or something like that just to hit it a bit more evenly around the edges. And you want to keep going until the gold metal surface is flush with the end of the hub. Once that's the case, just take a little bit of fresh grease on the end of your finger and we're just going to pre-lubricate that seal. Now we can flip the hub over and that seal will hold the bearing from falling out. And we're going to repeat the process for the outer wheel bearing. So again, pushing the grease up through the rollers until you start to see it come out the top. And again, wipe any excess grease around the outside of the bearing and we're going to drop it in with the smaller side facing down. We're going to take the leftover grease that we have on our gloves and we're going to take it over to the spindle and wipe it on there. Before we put the hub back onto the spindle, we just need to install our new axle oil seal, and it's important to make sure this goes in the right way with the spring on the inside and the larger side facing outwards towards you. So we're going to pop that in there and then we're going to use a bearing and seal driver to push that in. In this case we're going to use the 72mm driver again, but it just needs to be oversized. And we're going to tap that in gently with a hammer. And you just want to tap that in until it's flush with the end of the spindle all the way around. Now we're going to take our hub and pop it back onto the spindle and just take care that that outer wheel bearing doesn't fall off when you do this. So you can see there it tried to come out, so you just want to push it back in with your thumbs. You just want to use a little bit of that grease to pre-lubricate that axle oil seal for when the axle goes in. Now the thrust washer goes on. And it's important that we line up this little tab here with the key in the top of the spindle. So that must go in the top center. And then we're going to loosely thread on the lock nut by hand. We're going to put the brake disc back on the car now, so make sure you have a nice clean pair of gloves and give the disc itself a good wipe with some brake and parts cleaner before you do this. The next step is to make sure our wheel bearings are seated correctly and to set the preload of those bearings. And the way that you do that is you take your special service tool with the 3 prongs on the torque wrench and we're going to do up this lock nut to 43 foot-pounds or 59 Newton meters. Then with a clean pair of gloves, we're going to grab onto the disc and just rotate it back and forth, just making sure those bearings are moving freely. Now there should be some resistance, but not a massive amount. Then following the Toyota workshop manual, you want to torque the nut back up to 43 foot-pounds or 59 Newton meters. And then we're going to back it off to finger tight. Now at this stage, the Toyota workshop manual talks about using a spring tension gauge to check the preload. We don't have one, so we're going to be doing it by feel today, but if you do have a spring tension gauge, the figure you're looking for is 26 to 57 newtons. Now you'll notice that you have these match marks around the edge of the spindle. There are 3 of them. We need to try and line up one of those match marks with one of these 3 match marks on the lock nut here. And the way that you do that is from finger tight, we're going to nip it up a little bit and then we're going to go to the next set of match marks that line up. So I can see here that these 2 match marks are very close to lining up, so I just need to turn it a tiny bit more. Once you have the match marks aligned correctly, we're going to install our 2 Phillips head screws. And what those screws do is stop the lock nut from turning, which stops your wheel bearings from coming undone. Now there is a torque spec for these screws. It's only about 5.4 Newton meters, so you just need to nip these up. At this stage, it's a good idea just to do one final check and make sure those wheel bearings are seated correctly. There should be a little bit of resistance, but not a huge amount. Before we reinstate the ABS speed sensor, we're just going to give it a wipe with some brake and parts clean just to make sure that there's no metal or dirt on the sensor. And then you can pop that back in through the hole. Then we're going to reinstate the little 12mm bolt that we removed earlier. There is a torque spec for this bolt, which is 13 foot-pounds or 18 Newton meters, but we can't get a socket in there, so we're just going to snug it down with the 12mm spanner. We're just about ready to reinstate our axle now, but before we do, we'll just give this flange face a quick clean up. Just want to make sure you get any grease off of there. Once you're happy that's nice and clean, we're going to put the new gasket on, which comes with the kit. We've chosen to coat this gasket with Permatex Former gasket, which is just going to help in future this gasket come off a bit easier and help it seal a bit better as well. And you just want to make sure that it's seated all the way down, all the way around. And now we're going to reinstate the axle. And when you do this, just make sure you have it lined up so that the 3 holes line up with where your pins are. As you push this in, just be really careful not to damage that new axle oil seal. And then just push it in to squash that new gasket down. Then our 6 cone washers, flat washers and nuts go back on. Then we're going to take the 12mm socket on the socket wrench and we're just going to snug each of those down in a crisscross pattern. Then with the 12mm socket on the torque wrench, we're going to do these up to 25 foot-pounds, which is 34 Newton meters. With some cutters or a blade, we just want to cut the cable tie that was holding the brake caliper out of the way. And then being careful not to put too much pressure on that hose, we're going to grab the caliper and slot it back over the disc. There we go, it should sit down there by itself. And then we can reinstate our 2 17mm bolts with flat washers that we removed earlier. You might find that you need to wiggle the brake caliper a little bit to get the bolt holes to line up. Once they're both on finger tight, we can nip them up with the 17mm socket. The torque setting for these bolts is 76 foot-pounds or 103 Newton meters. And now we can pop the wheel back on. And then you can thread your 6 lug nuts back on. And then we're just going to snug them down with a 21mm socket. For the 80 series with steelies like this one, the torque spec is 105 foot-pounds or 142 Newton meters. If you do have the aluminium wheels, it's 76 foot-pounds or 103 Newton meters. And now we can lower the wheel back onto the ground. So again, jacking from underneath the axle housing, we're just going to lift the car slightly so that we can remove that jack stand. And once that's out of the way, we can slowly lower the car to the ground. With the rear axle sitting level, we're going to reinstate the drain plug and fill the diff with new oil. Before we do that, just make sure you remove the old crush gasket from that drain plug, and we're going to give it a quick clean up. With both diff plugs, you want to make sure you're using new crush gaskets, so we'll pop that on there, and then we'll thread that in by hand. And then we're going to do that up with the 24mm socket on the torque wrench. And the torque spec we're looking for here is 36 foot-pounds, which is 49 Newton meters. You might find it starts slowly as you're crushing that crush gasket down. You want to do the same thing with the filler plug. Make sure you remove that old crush gasket and give it a quick clean up. And we're going to have it ready to go with the new gasket so that we can put it in as soon as the diff oil starts to overflow the filler hole. We're going to be installing 3.25 litres of the diff oil. In this case it's a 90 weight oil, and you want to keep going until the diff oil starts to flow out of this hole, which is going to be about 3 and a bit of these bottles full. So once you get onto your last bottle, you want to have your filler plug with the new gasket ready to go so you can pop it in as soon as it starts to overflow from this hole. And there we go, the oil's just started to overflow that filler hole. So get the pump out of the way and we're going to pop that plug in. And you can just wipe up any excess. We'll give that a proper clean in a sec. Then again, take your torque wrench with the 24mm socket, and we're going to do this one up to the same as the drain plug, 36 foot-pounds or 49 Newton meters. And now that both plugs are in, we can give it a final clean up to get any loose oil off. And that's it guys, that's all there is to changing the rear wheel bearings and oil seal on your 80 or 105 series cruiser. If you enjoyed this video or you found it useful, please feel free to check out another video we've done on the front axle, which was a full swivel hub rebuild, so a little bit more challenging. We love hearing your feedback, so if there's anything you think we could have done better or something you'd like to see in future, please let us know in the comments down below. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video.